Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We have Farah Pandith with us. You guys have the bios in front of you, but just kind of quickly, Farah is an author, foreign policy strategist, former diplomat. She's worked for 3 different administrations, both Republican and Democrat, which is surprising in this world to think that that's actually still possible, but obviously an amazing perspective from that. Served as a special representative to the Muslim communities, serving both the Clinton and Kerry Secretary of State administrations. She's now a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she has just released a book.
Yes.
Sort of called How We Win, How Cutting Edge Entrepreneurs, Political Visionaries, Enlightened Business Leaders, and Social Media Mavens Can Defeat the Extremist Threat. I tried to memorize that.
Yeah,
it's a long one. But, and I think Farah will have copies of that outside after this program today, and we'll be signing them if we can find a Sharpie. Yes. So Farah, I wanted to start with just, obviously you have kind of an amazing background. How did you find yourself getting into sort of being on, I guess, on the front lines of countering extremism and working for administrations and some of these experiences you've had?
Well, so before I begin, I just really would like to thank all of you for coming out on a work evening. It really means a lot that you are all so interested. We have a packed room, and it's really sobering but also welcoming that everybody wants to hear about this issue. But I also would like to thank the World Affairs Council. I am a huge fan of the work that the World Affairs Councils across America do. I'm specifically impressed with the programming this morning and, of course, today, so thank you so very much. And Nelson, I don't know where you went. Oh, thank you very much for hosting us. I was trapped in this gorgeous view, which is why you guys started late, because I couldn't believe how gorgeous it is. But thank you for hosting. It really means a lot. Nick, it's a really important question, and actually many people don't ask me that question. So I'm glad you did.
Good, I'm glad I started with the good
I'm
one.
glad you started with it. So it is important, because I think when you hear somebody talk about this issue, as dangerous and scary as it is, you need to put a personal face to the person who's delivering what you're hearing. Who is she? Where did she come from? You can read a bio, but you can't really understand. So I want to just spend a moment to tell you that this isn't something that I could ever have imagined that I would ever be doing. Nobody in college decides that they're going to work on fighting groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. You don't imagine these things. I wish there wasn't such a job. I had an extraordinary upbringing outside of Massachusetts. I was born in northern India, in Kashmir, in Srinagar, and went back and forth as a young girl to India to visit my grandfather and my aunts and uncles. And so I tell you that because I had a global perspective very early on, even though I went to a super waspy private school outside of Boston. It was a very elite educational background. I could have been really trapped in my own little world if I had wanted, but my mother was super smart and made sure that every summer, instead of going to Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, we went to Kashmir so I could actually see where we came from. I say this to you because when I had decided to go to graduate school, I had been 3 years in the George H.W. Bush administration, and I decided that I wanted to do development work. That's what I wanted to do. I'd studied at USAID. I'd worked at USAID, and I thought I would go to graduate school and learn more about the power of development aid and humanitarian assistance. And so I applied. I got into the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and around the very same time that I got accepted, 2 things happened on this day, actually. In 1993. So those of you who understand what's been happening between India and Pakistan understand that this has been going on since the time of partition. And around 93, it was on the heels of another sort of insurgency. Every family in Kashmir has lost people, so we are not alone. But on this day, in 1993, my cousin's husband, who was a thoracic surgeon who had been trained in New York, was killed, and his body was left on my cousin's door. He was very well known, and as is the custom for people who practice Islam, you bury the body immediately. Because he was very well known, many, many, many people came to the house to take his body to move it to a cemetery. when that happened, there were hundreds of people in the street. So they're moving his body to the cemetery. There was a firing at the same time. So basically, just a shooting that just went into the crowd. And so we lost my cousin who had already died, but we also lost my other cousin on that same day. So it's very sobering, very, we aren't the only family that has experienced this kind of thing, but how is it connected to what I do now? When I went to Fletcher, that a few months later, to the Fletcher School to start my career in graduate school, thinking I was going to do diplomacy, two professors came to me and they said, you're studying international security studies also first, but another professor said, are you from such and such family? Meaning what I just told you. And I said, yeah. And Dr. Bose said, well, I don't understand why you're not studying what's happening between India and Pakistan. And I said, well, I could, but I really want to do this. And he said, Farah, you have a really unique opportunity at this moment in time to understand what's happening between these two countries. And you're Kashmiri. You were born there. Your family's from there. You come from this family. You can actually learn about things that others, you'll be able to see this in a new way. The Security Studies program from the Fletcher School gave me a grant that summer in between my first 2 years to go to Kashmir under the radar screen. I do not recommend this to any students that are in the audience. I don't know how my mother allowed me to do this. I just have no idea.
A little different than Nantucket, right?
Nuts. But I love Nantucket, but still, what ended up happening is that summer, I didn't tell anybody except for one uncle why I was really going to Kashmir. I went in under the radar screen, told the Indian government I was going to see family, but actually I was going to interview militants. And so I spent that summer interviewing militants, and it was the first time that I actually experienced what it was for a young person to be so energized by an ideology that they would be willing to die for it. And I came back out of that summer having interviewed all of the players in the militancy, along with all of the Indian government officials who were in charge of all of this. I turned down an interview with Benazir Bhutto, actually, because I wanted to do all three sides, if you would. But anyway, that's how I cut my teeth, if you will, on extremism. And I wouldn't have imagined, I mean, honestly, Nick, I did my master's thesis on it. I focused on that. Did I even imagine such a thing as Al-Qaeda? Did I even imagine that a 9/11 could happen? Of course not. But when I was working in Boston on 9/11, I was on the 41st floor of a building, very similar, gorgeous view. Logan Airport is right over there. I remember looking out on a perfect sunny day, hearing the reports. Remember that technology wasn't what it is today, so we're getting bits and bobs of information. But I remember looking out at Logan Airport, and my heart just sunk, thinking, if this has anything to do with anyone who's saying anything about Islam or Muslims, I remember feeling that. And when we found out in the next few days that some terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda was claiming to speak for Islam, was claiming to define my country, America, I couldn't bear it. You know, I had a visceral reaction. I walked into my boss's office and I said, Steve, I love working in Boston. I love my job. I was making a lot of money. Everything was great. My family's there, my friends are there. And I said, you've got to help me find a way to come back to serve. Because I had served before, I knew what public service meant. But I came back into government because of 9/11, because I felt that there was something that I could do. And frankly, honestly, Nick, I didn't care. What I told everybody, I didn't work for George, I've never worked on a campaign in my life. So, but I said, all I know is that I'm an American, I'm a Muslim, I studied this. Is there something that I can do to be helpful when we have just been attacked? And so the work that began, it's a long answer to you, but the work came from my heart. It didn't come from some sort of anything else. But as I experienced what we were going through right after 9/11 and working at the National Security Council and hearing colleagues and the president, you know, all of his advisors talking about not just the battle of arms, but a battle of ideas, and understanding that we had to do more to stop the recruitment because Al-Qaeda couldn't be Al-Qaeda if it didn't have recruits. I began to work on this issue in earnest, and so from that, everything else went forward.
That's amazing. So sort of, you kind of talked about your journey. How have your sort of thoughts about, I mean, this is going to be a broad question, but also, I guess, give you a lot of latitude in how you want to answer, but how have your thoughts evolved about sort of the extremist threat, about what we do to combat it, and you know, do you sort of see it getting worse now than, you know, when you first kind of started looking at it professionally?
Well, let me just be really clear. When we talk about extremism, we're on the heels of a moment in time when the only kind of extremism we're talking about is not just those by terrorist organizations that claim Islam. So I'm just saying that you are obviously, you know all of this, but I think it's important to state that the kind of extremism that I work on, you have just heard. That's, you know, I'm working on groups that are preying upon primarily young Muslim kids under the age of 30, because those are the troops that they want to fill their armies with. And you know, when I think about what we had imagined when 9/11 happened, we certainly hadn't imagined something like the so-called Islamic State, but nor did we imagine that the kind of ideology of us versus them would result 20 years later after the 9/11 events, to now have a world in which we don't just have AQ, which is still alive and well, and we can talk about that if people are interested in understanding Al-Qaeda's cells and how they're working. But we also have a non-defeated Islamic State, because it's not about the physical territory, which we will get into. What does it really mean? But we have that idea, and people who are mobilized and inspired by that idea in every corner of the planet, including here in Seattle. So, you know, this is not dead. And we have, if that wasn't enough, and we have organizations that claim the us versus them ideology in other ways. So we now have a movement of hate that is unprecedented. Could we have imagined this on 9/11? No. Could we have ever imagined America would be a country in which we would allow the white supremacists to thrive? Would we ever allow a moment in which people are using every tool in the toolbox for evil as opposed to using every tool in the toolbox for good? No. So when I look back at almost 20 years of this endeavor to try to puncture the ideology of us and them, I'm deeply disappointed in our creativity, in our commitment, and our devotion to what we know is right as humans. It is not right for hate to rise. It is not acceptable in America that we call out the other in such vile, disgusting ways. It is not right. This is not about Muslims. This is not about Christians. This is not about Jews. This is not about Sikhs. This is not about everyone in between who have been attacked since 9/11 in our country. This is about a thriving ideology that has been allowed to bloom because there aren't enough antibodies in the system at a community level to make sure that young people who are navigating growing up, whose brains don't develop until the age of 24, who are searching for belonging and identity, who find that ideology appealing. We have not done enough to stop it. So government, the reason why that title is so long is because it isn't just about government. And even though right after 9/11, Nick, we did recognize how limited the US government's role could be in authenticity, in delivering the countermeasures that we need. The front line of this is not the government or any government in the world. They have a role to play. We can talk about their role. But they aren't able to talk to a 16-year-old or a 21-year-old. They don't have that ability to do that. Who does? It is peers that have that ability, and it's non-government organizations who have been testing and piloting programs for almost, 12 years is the longest time that we have actually been working on CVE kind of work. We haven't seen the kind of attention, commitment of resources, power, scale, leadership to do that. And this is not calling out either the Democratic or the Republican administrations or the current one. This is calling out all of us to say we have reached beyond a crisis point because what's coming is very dangerous. Let me give you some stats. 1/4 of the planet is Muslim. All of you know this. 1 billion people are under the age of 30 who are Muslim. 1 billion. That is the demographic from which the bad guys are recruiting. So we're not talking about an isolated group somewhere here or there. We're talking about a global population that is targeted by very effective and efficient entities that want to recruit. And so we didn't imagine any of this coming.
Yeah, so I mean, to maybe talk about some of the positive elements here, I mean, where have you seen these sort of people working at the community level, these, some of the organizations that you alluded to, where it has been effective, and why has it been effective in kind of reaching, and again, sort of the point that you made, this isn't just about extremism related to Muslims, but sort of more broadly reaching these kind of impressionable people, in that sort of younger demographic.
Well, let's be really clear that every young person growing up, everyone, I don't care your background or your intelligence levels or your education levels or anything, every human growing up goes through this questioning of like, who am I? What's the purpose of my life? What am I supposed to be doing? That's just normal, okay? That's called growing up. But there's a fierce attention that we have understood post 9/11. Basically every single day since 9/11, you've seen the word Islam or Muslim on the front pages of papers online and offline. That has been fierce attention at the very same time that young people are going through this growing up process. And as they're navigating through their identity and they're asking questions, they are getting answers from the bad guys at a rate and at a pace and at a curated delivery system that makes them feel like those are the right answers. Okay, so we have a huge problem on our hands. When we think about how to disrupt that system, how can we disrupt the process where they're finding the bad guys more appealing than sort of a good actor? We know that government has no authenticity, they have no ability to make those connections. But we do know, one, peers. I mean, anybody who is a parent understands the kids aren't talking to you, they're talking to their friends. So peers make a difference, influencers in the community makes a difference, and local makes a difference. So what's happening in this part of Seattle isn't what's happening in another part of Seattle. You guys get all of this. So where do we look at community organizations and local NGOs that can actually deliver the kind of touch points, if you will, as these young people are growing up? So how do we think about the behavioral components of this adolescent search or this search for belonging? What can we do along the way to make sure that they're moving away? How can we get content from former extremists who have been on the dark side and have come back, who can talk one-on-one with you? You can deploy that kind of content in a lot of different ways that we've tested and we've tried in the offline space and in the online space. We've gone to technology companies who have also worked with NGOs to deliver in the online space content through videos, through other things that actually move those kids when they start doing searches about how to join the Islamic State or how can I be a better Muslim. You're moving them into, you're using all the tools that you would normally think about to get kids away. What the problem has been is that the scale, so we've tested this stuff, it works. Congress will not give money towards this because they want some sort of super duper proof that if you give money towards that thing, you have to promise me that that person will never become a bad guy. You can never make that promise. It is impossible to do that. They have been very risk averse in doing that, even though we've spent $6 trillion on the wars since 9/11. And in all the time that we have known the so-called Islamic State, the percentage of the money that we have spent on the ideological manifestations of this war to fight ISIS has been 0.0138% of the budget on soft power. Soft power doesn't risk life. Soft power is an alternative that should be used in conjunction with the physical war. So we have to decimate their capacity to do harm, but we also need to decimate the ideas that bring on people into this thing. So if we know that local actors, local NGOs can do this, and they've tried and tested things, and you're going to say to me, well, so if you know all this, what's the problem? NGOs are NGOs. They have to raise money to keep the lights on. I mean, let's get real. They cannot scale what it is that they know. If we could do nothing but one thing right now, if somebody said to me, Farah, here's a magic wand, what would you do? I'd say every single CVE, countering violent extremism is this field, CVE. I would say that every single CVE program that we've experimented with and your taxpayer dollars has paid for around the world should be scaled. Forget about building new things, trialing new things. Even if all you do right now is just scale 24/7, building the antibodies in the system, in a few short years you will see a very different feel for those kids growing up. We do not have anything close to the machine that we need to be building those antibodies. We have played whack-a-mole here and there. You have a conversation where governments around the world keep talking about the hotspots that they need to be thinking about. Oh my God, Afghanistan is more important than Syria. Syria is more important than Nigeria. Nigeria is less important than, I mean, that's the game you hear in the New York Times, the Washington Post, that's what you hear. I'm here to tell you this ideology is global. I have gone to almost 100 countries on behalf of our nation, and I've talked to tens of thousands of Muslim kids under the age of 30. This us versus them thing is real. The ideologies exist and they're growing. So what we are failing in is not just we don't have a strategy and that we haven't scaled anything, but we haven't learned from what we've learned, which is if we go at this pace, the bad guys will continue to beat us, and they are winning right now. They are delivering bespoke extremism for particular communities around the world that make sense to these guys. We are smarter, we are faster, we are more creative, we're Americans. We can do this. My question is, why haven't we?
So, I mean, but what you're, I think, also suggesting is that that these sort of NGOs and people at the pointy end of the spear need more coordination, more resources, which is what generally we look to government to do. Correct? So, how can we? I mean, it's always a question: how do we spur government to do things? It brings up two questions: how can we convince our own government and other governments to do it, and two, is it possible to sort of come, we already have polarization, we always have to mention it no matter what of these sort of topics we do, but how can we make sure, thinking in a U.S. perspective, that it survives from one administration to the next, right? Because it just seems to kind of be some of these whack-a-mole sort of seems to move with the sentiments of the particular party that's in power.
Well, let me be really clear on the role of government. The government can do several things. It doesn't have to be the folks that tell NGOs what to do. That's not what they should do. Government should be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we know work on the ground. They can be, that's their strength. That's what government, especially the US government, can be, that convener. The private sector has a dramatically important role to play in this, and they have been absent from all of this for 20 years. The little tiny bits of efforts that some companies have put into it are small little efforts. I'm glad that they have. I think it's important that they've tested. Now is the time to put your attention on the role of companies within a community. And I think that when we look at the consumers, not just millennials and Generation Z, who are looking to companies to be beyond just the person that makes the widget, but to stand for something, I think we're in a moment where we can see a demand from consumers to say, who are we? What do we stand for as humans? And again, this is not just about protecting Muslim youth from groups like the so-called Islamic State. This is protecting all of us from the predators that are out there who are spewing hate. And that's the way we need to look at this. This is not a terrorism problem. This is a hate problem. And this is a reflection on who we are as humans about what it is we want to do. So I think that the government's role has to be increased in the sense of, and this is very policy wonky kind of stuff, but Congress has not delivered on the kind of pressure to put money into this issue. They put pressure on NGOs to say, prove to us that if we tell you to do this. But what I would say to Congress is, there is no one silver bullet, which is what they want, and they have to be willing to experiment. I often think about this one example, and it's not a perfect one, so forgive me, but I think it will give you a sense of where I'm going with this. When in the 1980s, when HIV/AIDS came into this world and we began to hear about it, it was super scary for all of us. Not only was it scary because we didn't know what it was or how people got it and what would happen to our lifespan, but we also couldn't talk about it because it had something to do with sex, and in the 1980s we couldn't really talk about that. We couldn't say the word condom out loud in the 1980s. I mean, there were things that were going on that prevented us from even having those conversations, yet we were dramatically affected because we didn't know. I mean, it could happen, anything could happen. But what happened? Government wasn't the answer. If government had been the only ones who were in charge of dealing with HIV/AIDS, we would still be dealing with HIV/AIDS. But what happened was all of society said, we've got to take a role on this. Faith groups got involved in education, parent-teacher associations got involved, schools got involved, colleges got involved, there were movements, foundations got involved, they put money into research. Oh my gosh, every part of our world said there is something we can do. And you know what? If you get HIV/AIDS, you can live with it today. So I'm saying to everyone, listen, I know it's really scary and people may think, my kid's not a Muslim, that's not going to be a problem. We have data that tells us what hate can do. We've seen it, some of you have seen it in your lifetimes in extremely horrible ways. I don't understand how we can sit on the sidelines and allow this to happen. So for me, it's government, stand up, do what you need to do, get the money going, and let's help these NGOs. It's foundations, what the heck are you thinking? Give some money to these NGOs so they can do things at scale, and I'm not talking about little teeny bits and little grants that don't do anything. Give them the money they need so that they are not thinking about keeping the lights on and paying their 20 and 30-year-old. And by the way, this is an important point, and I say this with just despair and disgust. As somebody who worked very closely with NGOs, you know who's doing this work for us on behalf of the US government? NGOs, right? But who's in those NGOs? 20 and 30-year-old kids. Do you know what they get paid? How little they get paid? To do what? What are they doing? They are looking at beheading videos. They're all day, every day looking at horrible, disgusting, sick stuff. There's nobody on staff that helps them on the mental health pieces of this. There's no beautiful cafeteria for them to go to or some quiet room where they can rest. They're doing this on behalf of us. And the people in those NGOs have to fight for every single penny that they have so that they can keep the lights on. And I think that's outrageous. So I'm asking philanthropy, do something bold. Think about this in a new way. Act with compassion for these NGOs around the world who have answers and can test things. And I say to the private sector, your data, your ability to understand what humans do, the cultural listening that you've done, the social listening that you've done, can dramatically help the frontline workers who are devising and developing programs. So can't we all work together on this? And for me, the answer is all of us. I'm not Pollyanna. I know that there's not some special little magic wand that I can use. But I do know that we haven't even begun to try. This effort that we are putting out there, this idea that we've tried it, nothing works, it's not working, it's because we haven't even, it's absurd that we're even talking about this as an effort. It wasn't an effort. It's a little bit of here and a little bit of there. When we try to do things as a government or as a people, we do them. If we say we need to make sure that every, the behavior changes in America about a particular thing, and we want to get out there. It may take a couple of years, but guess what? We have changed behavior. We've changed behavior on smoking. We've changed behavior on recycling. We've changed behavior on things that nobody ever said you could do. We can certainly help protect youth.
Farah, we'll also be acolytes after this, spreading the word.
Yes.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about, what is particularly attractive about the ideology that's sort of being given to these people? I think it's probably was a caricature, but maybe true, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of when we were talking at the kind of in the sort of right after 9/11, we had this idea of people who committed these atrocities sort of being promised, things in the afterlife, and it was sort of this more, I mean, this is all religious, but sort of very religiously focused kind of incentives, I guess. And
What is that?
sort of focused on the religion and afterlife, and maybe with this, and again, I may be wrong about that, so correct me if I'm wrong. But does that continue now, or I guess in my view, you know, sort of people of they're a little bit. I am not in the under 24 or under 30, unfortunately. But still, I think people are, you know, the youth of the world today are much more savvy than that, you know. And is it that same sort of kind of sort of tropes that are being used, or are the wars that have been sort of going on for so long, or are there other things that are being used to kind of attract recruits, to use your words?
It's a really important question. What makes somebody join something so horrible? And I remember right after 9/11, we had all these wonderful theories about who these bad guys really were who got on the planes. One of which was they have to be super poor because, I mean, they must have been paid to do this. And another was, you know, they weren't educated, because certainly an educated person would never do this. We find out, of course, that they're rich. We find out that they're super well educated. They're engineers, they're doctors. I mean, all of these things that you think about have been debunked. The only good news post 9/11 in any of this horror is that there's been a lot of research that's been done about, we've interviewed people who are former extremists. We understand what's going on a little bit more. And so all of this stuff about education levels, poverty, all these kinds of things, just take them off the table. Think they matter in a secondary source, okay? But right now, I want you to be thinking about the thing that I talked about in terms of identity, and this navigation of identity, this question of who am I, and that's very specific to a demographic post 9/11 that asks themselves these questions. Now, when the bad guys are coming after these young people, they're beginning, there are many formulas on how to do this. Every group doesn't do it the same way, and there are lots of different messages that they're sending to them to lure them in. When you prey upon a person, the first thing you're going to do, a gang does this too, is to not, sometimes you don't have to go directly and say, come join me, I'm the best there is. But they start with softer kinds of things. They move you along. Some people really want that hardcore thing. They're looking for something that is dramatically clear to them what it means to be a, quote, real Muslim. So they've softened things up. I used this example this morning, but I think it's a good one. There's a chapter in my book that I call Shake Google. And it is meant to provoke, obviously, but it is sort of this idea that technology gives you the answers that you're looking for, authentic answers. And that authenticity is clearly in quotes, because it's whatever that young person believes to be the most authentic thing. Gangs recruit the same way. You know, you want to belong, you want to be in the in group, and that's why peers matter. That's why local influencers matter. It is not who the US government thinks. I mean, one of the things that I think is hilarious is people keep still talking about the guy with the longest beard and the tallest hat being the most authentic voice on Islam. Are you kidding me? That 16-year-old kid and that 18-year-old kid doesn't care about the guy with the longest beard and the highest hat. They care about what makes sense to them about what they think the religion is. So when you're talking about, you're right, these kids, millennials and Generation Z, are super savvy. And most of them have some sort of connection to a smartphone that can connect in all kinds of ways. But what seems authentic to them doesn't have any bearing. They're not analyzing that authenticity. They're seeing it for what they think it is going to be, and to answer questions. So that underwear bomber in Nigeria, who grew up in an affluent household, who was studying in London, and went online to ask Google, why does my family not eat halal meat? He did not go to his parents. He did not go to his brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. He went to Sheikh Google. And Sheikh Google gave him back an answer, which is, your family isn't religious enough, which brought him down another path and then another path. And pretty soon he was talking to people who were telling him how to be that authentic Muslim. So the messages are different, but I mean, the sort of the tools to get there are different, but the message is very clear. I want you to be the best you can be. Now, you didn't ask this question, but I'm going to connect Saudi Arabia to this because it's important.
It's going to be my next topic.
Yeah,
so
good. So there's a chapter in the book that is called Plague from the Gulf. Yes, I'm very subtle. It was really important for me to tell people what I saw in an authentic and real way. I have no super secret mission here, okay? I don't believe there's only one kind of Muslim and a real Muslim, and I just am not making a religious point. But I have something that I saw and that I told people in this book, and that is this. No matter where in the world I went, the presence of Saudi Arabia's ideology was present. So whether I was in a Muslim majority country and talked to them, or talked to Muslims in where Muslims live as a minority, everywhere around was a presence of this sinister idea of us versus them, this sinister idea that there's only one way to be a Muslim, a monolithic view of being a Muslim, and a teaching of that monolithic view that was very disruptive to the world that we want to live in. So Wahhabism is the kind of expression of Islam that is present in Saudi Arabia. I am not talking about, as I said, it's like but what they are doing and have done for decades, and we have looked the other way, is some things that have been talked about, like textbooks, free textbooks that they've sent around the world that promote a monolithic view of Islam, promote an us and them, promote vile descriptions of Jews or other kinds of Muslims. They've translated the Quran in very specific ways and have given it for free around the world, including to our own country, in case you guys didn't know. Free Islams free Qurans that come in that are translated in a way that does not give the plurality of the expression of what it says. And in addition, other tools. Hitler did this too, what I'm about to tell you. The scrubbing of history is one of the most effective ways to make sure that your way is the only way that anybody ever sees. So they have gone into communities all over the world and have taken human civilization and scrubbed it away and replaced it with their version of what things are. So 1,000-year-old mosques that have been decimated and replaced by Saudi Arabia's way of expressing not just architecture, but what they're promoting. Training of imams in Saudi Arabia that then go and are deployed around the world. There are many, many systems that I talk about, many different tools, in this system that underlies extremism, but it connects to this point of what they're trying to teach. If the soil has been rich with minerals that actually allow things to bloom, things will bloom. And what you have to ask is what's been in the soil for the last many decades. And my argument in my book is you cannot fight this extremist ideology of us versus them if you don't understand the planks that make up the system that underlies extremism. And one of those very serious planks is Saudi Arabia. So this isn't about the politics of Saudi Arabia in terms of vis-a-vis other countries in the Middle East, or this is very particular. I want to be really clear. It is about a multi-decade effort with billions of dollars that has been spent on making sure that people erase their local expressions and narratives about Islam and replace them with one way of being Muslim. And the reason why that should bother everybody is not just from the anthropological component of all of this, but because when you erase the diversity of Islam, when you say that there is only one way to be a Muslim, it allows groups like the so-called Islamic State, the Taliban, Shabab, I could go on, to build off of that and to bring you forward. That's why it's important.
I mean, and sort of sticking with Saudi Arabia, I mean, with the ascension of MBS, I mean, obviously we've had the Khashoggi killing, and that sort of reveals a certain realpolitik going on there. But there's also been the narrative that they're sort of quieting the clerics, at least at home. Do you think that that's correct in any way, at least for Saudi Arabia? How has MBS and that sort of new regime potentially changed or not changed at all?
It is important to put your money where your mouth is. I have seen no evidence on the ground that there's been a change of approach. In fact, I think that there have been some really shiny things that have been done to tell a story to America and other countries that they're changing. So for example, President Trump goes to Riyadh at his very first visit, which I thought was a huge mistake for all the reasons I've just described about not promoting Saudi Arabia's version of the world. So he goes there, he tells the world that they're our partner and our friends, and they are, let's be clear, they are allies in many other things. It's not like you only can do one-dimensional diplomacy. There are things, and I'm not advocating, let me be clear, I'm not advocating throwing them out with the bathwater, no. You can do two things at once. We have to be more strident on the things that we're talking about. But, so there have been shiny examples. You'll recall a picture of President Trump. His hand is on a glowing orb.
Literally a shiny thing, right?
Right. So that was part of the launch of this giant new center that David Ignatius talks about if you read his piece in the Washington Post, which I urge you all to read. It's excellent, about Saudi Arabia and the Khashoggi killing and what we have learned. It was just out yesterday, I think. So they have this amazing multi-million-dollar center that is a disinformation center that is going to fight ISIS propaganda, and they built it. Now they're doing other things and fighting. And I've been there. It's state of the art. It's absolutely amazing. It's the kind of thing you'd see in a movie. You know, it's wild. You know, but that's not enough. I mean, you can't just have slick, images of things that you're doing. You really have to show. And I remember hearing when I talk about things like Qurans, which are really so basic, right? So you're in a community, Saudi Arabia, the government of Saudi Arabia gives you free Qurans. You're thinking, oh, how wonderful, free Qurans, I can teach, whatever. But you're not educated enough to even understand what they have done with these Qurans, or that there are, in fact, many ways to translate the Quran. And in fact, you should spend some time learning about the different variations of why and how people. This is not some easy book you just pick up and it's the easiest. I mean, you can't just pick up the St. James Bible and suddenly know everything there is about Christianity. I'm sorry. Excuse me, losing my mind. Exactly. But it's hard. You have to study. You have to look at this. You have to explore. You have to analyze. But people are getting free Qurans that say a particular thing. Now, the Saudi government is saying to the world that they have looked at this problem of both textbooks and Qurans. They have fixed the problem. The old textbooks are no longer in circulation. The old Qurans are no longer in circulation. But in fact, if you go to the State Department's human rights reports, you will see that they are still in circulation and that they are still out there. My argument in the book, and I say, okay, if you're Saudi Arabia and you're telling me that you've picked up all those bad Qurans, let's have a buyback program. That's great. If they're not out there, doesn't mean anything. Give me $50 for every Quran that I can find. Let's put that money into NGOs that are fighting bad things. I mean, really. So I'm not joking. I think that's a good idea. So my question is, either we're going to buy everything that they're putting on the table saying that they're doing on this particular issue, or we're going to poke at it and we're going to scratch at it and we're going to reveal to the world what's really going on. We haven't been bold enough to actually tell that real story. And by the way, it's not just America. Very few countries in the world have actually been honest about what they're seeing in their communities. And it's frightening that they are that scared. I think it's important that we tell. Look, I'm telling something in this book about Saudi Arabia that will shock you and surprise you, but it's what I saw on the ground. I didn't obviously make up any stories. I saw this stuff, but one of the reasons that I thought long and hard about whether or not I tell things the way I did was because I was so lucky to be able to serve my nation. And your taxpayer dollars paid my salary from 2003 until 2014 as I traveled around the world. You paid for me to do the job that I did. I think it is my responsibility to tell every American what I saw, and that's what I did.
Joan Lawson, I have an interesting perspective that some of you don't have maybe. I was married to an Iranian for 10 and a half years and had 4 children through him. And so I've been involved with Muslims, as we called them in the 50s, since 1956. And as a non-religious person, I see a lot of parallels with our way of treating people who are not right-wing Christians in our country. We give Bibles. There are Bibles in every hotel room, and we use that certain religion. Anyway, I want to know whether there are equivalents of you in other countries talking about how terrible United States is going into their countries and trying to Christianize their people and say that Muslimhood is bad and Christianity is good.
That is a really, really great question. No, I haven't. I don't know of anybody that's done that.
Thank you. Very insightful. Could you, on the topic of information, give me your perspective from your various tours of duty on how information sharing has improved since 9/11? I mean, Homeland Security is a huge machine apparatus, but in your view, are those things better now?
I think it's a great question. So specifically from the intel side, yeah, clearly, if we knew that 9/11 was going to happen, we would not have let it happen. We are in a very different moment in world history today. We have stood up spectacularly and very importantly the kinds of infrastructure that we need to make sure that we are safe. So, for example, DHS, the National Counterterrorism Centers, and we could go on about the various things that we have done to make sure we are safer, and we are safer. We are absolutely safer from many different points of view. I would argue too that the way in which we share information, and it's not perfect, please. I mean, it's not perfect, but we are much safer, and also the way in which we share information with our partners and allies has improved dramatically, including, and I didn't talk about this because I'm not an expert on it, but it's important for us to understand, terrorist finance is an important component of all of this. And I highly recommend a book by Juan Zarate, who wrote he is the guy behind all of it. He worked in the Bush administration on helping to develop our systems to track this, but the terrorist finance piece is really, really important. Our ability now, today, to be able to share information, to understand to follow the flow of money, much, much, much better. We also are far better along the path of because, well, there are two things that are happening, both in the open world, what you're seeing and the conversations, as well as sort of what's happening in the quiet space within governments. You are seeing more communication around what's working, what's not working, what more we have to do. But the thing that is troubling, I mean, if all this great stuff is happening, which it is, and we are safer in many ways, what we are not doing is, and obviously that's my argument in the book about the ideological war, is we haven't stood up the equal amount of systems to stop that ideology. So where is the equivalent of the centers around the world who can actually manage that flow of information about learning about the ideology and radicalization? Where are the centers of excellence in our country from the social scientists who have spent a lot of time and interest in understanding the human mind and how this connects with why isn't 20 years after 9/11, why don't we have that? I don't understand how we don't have that. And not only that, there is, I mean, this is one of the most shocking things to me, and if I were in government, I'd be screaming bloody murder. Today, to this day, we cannot tell you every single program everywhere in the world that is doing countering violent extremism. We do not have. We can tell you every single satellite everywhere in the world. We can tell you where every troop is. We can tell you where every submarine is. We can tell you where every boat is. But we cannot tell you every NGO in the world and every community that is working on fighting hate. How is that possible? So if you don't have that kind of analytical ability, how do you deploy it? And then the final point about sharing of information. One of the biggest arguments, I didn't answer this in this way when you asked the question about what government can do, and this is just the most straightforward thing. Somebody wakes up every single day in our country and is in charge of the physical manifestations of war. That person is in charge of every component of our military. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is responsible for every component of our military, right? And reports directly to the president. Who, may I ask, is the equivalent on the soft power. There isn't anybody. So nobody wakes up every day to understand the entire landscape of the globe, what's in our toolbox, how do we deploy it, what do we need to do, where are the black holes, how do we fill them, nobody's in charge of that. And there wasn't anybody in charge in the Bush administration or the Obama administration, so I'm not just blaming the Trump administration. But what I am saying is in the Bush administration, we talked about it, we couldn't quite figure out how to do it. Same thing happened in the Obama administration. We couldn't really know what we're going to do. Today, we have no excuse. Right now, we are looking at unprecedented levels of us versus them ideologies, learning from each other, living off of each other, and are going to dramatically affect the bottom line for everybody's existence on this. And even if it's not, forgive me for even saying it like this, even if it's not a 9/11, even if we've now gotten so used to just the thing on the train happening or the thing in the church happening, that's not acceptable. It is not okay that something happened in Charlottesville the way it did or in Christchurch. It is not okay. And we have the capacity to share information in a different way, not just the old way. And that's what's important about the question you're asking, I think.
I am here because of the Christchurch advert on Facebook, and because I thought it was a salient and poignant topic. And the question I want to bring up is sometimes CVE programs are critiqued for being Islamophobic, and I wanted to ask, how do you think that the U.S. can use soft power and CVE programs to address mass shootings, white terror, and terrorism from U.S. citizens in the U.S.?
I thank you so much for that question, and I'm really happy you asked it for this reason. I think that we have politicized the term CVE, and I think that it's become a lightning rod for political purposes. So I spend time in the book for telling people where that term came from and what we were trying to do with it, because the way I use it is the way I learned what I understood it to be, because I was there as we were building it. Okay? Countering violent extremism is the war of ideas, the us versus them, many us versus thems. When we designed this idea of doing something for soft power, we knew that in order to be able to do this, it meant that it had to be non-kinetic. This was not a manifestation of what the military was going to do. It was all the attention was on what communities could do to fight an us versus them. It was not about police force. It was not about drones hovering over people's houses listening in. That's not CVE. I don't know what that is, but that's not CVE. Okay? CVE are programs that live through local communities that are in charge of making sure that we debunk the us versus them in a lot of different ways. That is what So it isn't only about groups like Al-Qaeda or the so-called Islamic State. It absolutely is about any kind of organization, non-state actors, that are deploying that ideology to build recruits. So when we began all of this, we were, in fact, looking at not just AQ, but we were also looking at other things. But luckily, the numbers of motivators for hate groups like the one that guy in New Zealand used was not on the rise. But today, CVE can be used if we do it right across local communities. And I just don't. I want to be. I shouldn't have said it this way. Not just NGOs, because I argue also. I think that there's a missing link in the way in which we've approached, many missing links in the way we've approached CVE, because I think it takes all of community, which is where I have been very vocal about behavioral scientists and the medical communities, because they have information to share with us. So I'd love to see some of the money that goes into CVE working with NGOs, local hospitals, and others to work together. So CVE can be deployed in a lot of different ways, but it's non-kinetic. And it isn't through sort of policing. So I understand the argument that political people have made about this is only about Muslims, you're going after Muslims, this is, I understand why they have done that. But they're not looking at what these programs actually are.
My name is Tom Hayward. I was a member of the of the Joint Chiefs years and years ago. My personal interest is deeply in the security of America, in the screwed up world. I've been a member of this organization for 18 or 19 years. This is easily the best meeting of all.
That's very kind of you.
And Nelson, please make this available to all of us. I hope there isn't some proprietary thing that would prevent us from being able to exploit this, because that's what we really need to hear you all over this city, all over the country.
Thank you, sir.
I am clearly troubled with I have a strong negative interest, radical Islam, Sharia, Muslim Brotherhood kind of conclusion as the trouble we have globally, but as it's creeping into the U.S. I'm going to suggest I can't sort out how we can pick up on what you're saying that isn't anti-Muslim. You can't talk anything in this country about Muslims in any critical way because of its politically incorrect, whatever it is. How do you get us started?
Sir, first of all, thank you very much for those very kind comments. And certainly for your service to our nation. It's really hard to have honest conversations in America today. You are correct when you say that there's a heightened sense of, people can't hear because they just become crazy on a lot of different issues, not just this one. So the de-escalation of anger is really one of the first things I have to say. I don't understand how the switch was turned so far so fast, but we need to turn it back just slightly so we can actually hear each other and have the kinds of conversations that even if one does not agree with what somebody else is saying, that we can be respectful enough that we know how to listen and we know how to engage. So we've lost that. That's the first thing. So on the issue that I have been working on, some of the things I talk about are nano interventions. And what I mean by that is really the one-to-one way in which we live our lives. And that may sound really, really simplistic, but because it's exactly what you said, there's been a change in the way in which we think about things. So I want to say something to you that's very personal. And just because it will give you an example, even though I came to this country when I was a baby, I grew up outside of Boston, as I told you, I have never, ever, ever felt different. I grew up never being asked anything about my faith or where I came from. That experience is not the same for young kids growing up today, but also for me. I'm 51, okay? Today, having served 3 presidents, the majority of my professional career has been in service to our nation. People ask me today why I speak English so well. And they ask me how my country allowed somebody who wasn't American to serve. Okay? That is happening today. Now, I get why it's happening. It's not, listen, I get why it's happening. There's a lot of reasons why. But when I talk about nano interventions, it means that you have to have the ability not to scream at the top of your voice when that kind of thing happens, and to sort of de-escalate, and to actually think about how we think about the other. But the other thing, sir, is I think what's really important is the way in which we talk about who we are as Americans. And there are many ways to do that. One of the things that I know on the little small slice of the work that I do, one of the things that I've noticed about Americans, and as a proud American, I say this too, we don't learn history in a way that allows us to really understand where we've been and where we are. We've had a very careful, curated, cute expression of where we, and those tales actually make a difference to the way young people grow up. So on the very specific questions about race or heritage, we need to be more honest about who we are, where we come from. and not just use, which is right to say that the greatest strength of America is its diversity, but we need to go one step further and to say, where did we come from? How, when we arrived at this country, the original tribes that were here, let's learn more about them. I mean, all of those kinds of things build off of each other. So we have an honest frame and an honest foundation from which to talk about things. And then, sir, the final point. I know that there are entities in the post-9/11 world that are churning out their versions of what it is the problem really is, and have spent a lot of time designing the way they talk about religion, not just Islam, but other religions too. And I think that we have to urge people to be analytical thinkers and to go beyond the headline of what any paper, any thing that goes across your screen says, and to say, is that really the case? Somebody said to me the other day on a radio show that Islam, and I'm not an expert on Islam. I don't claim to be an Islamic scholar, nor do I want to be. There are people who have spent their life doing this. But that person said to me on the phone, and I'm telling you this because you get it why, but he said, you know, I understand that Islam is a religion in which you are supposed to kill the other.
Oh.
No, he did. But but okay. So, but he said, you know, he told me, and it's on the radio. You can hear the interview. He said, I've read the Quran. I see where it says that, and you're supposed to take the sword and kill people who are not Muslim. And I said, sir, first of all, I'm really happy you took the time to read. You know, that's great. But I want to tell you, like, logically, there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. If every single one of them was supposed to pick up the sword, we would have, for 1,400 years, we would be having a lot of, you know, conflict. So we need to go beyond and not just about Muslims. It's about every other. And I've said this to Muslim communities all over the world who have been poisoned with an anti-Semitic point of view and have said to them, what do you know about Judaism? What do you know about Christianity? What do you know about Hinduism? And I say the exact same thing to them too. Take the time to learn and to explore. It isn't enough to just hear what somebody tells you that somebody's going to do. I'm so glad grateful for the question. Thank you, sir.
I've been to Beirut twice because my wife grew up over there, evacuated in 1967. She fled. We've been back to see friends twice. The first time they had just rebuilt the downtown. The second time we went, I was on the do not go list because things were happening horribly, and we went to the Georgian Hotel. It had been bombed, and Hariri was lying in state, and we stood in line and watched that. So there's that. It's real. But what I'm interested in, I've worked with, maybe 10, 15 NGOs in Seattle, East African, 10 of them based. And what I'm interested in is the books that can explain the editions of the Quran, which I've also read, that are less bloodthirsty or more actual. And the same with the Bible, for that matter. So there's the reading question. There's the local and faraway NGOs. I'd love your recommendation of who's doing good work where their missions could be either adapted to your goals or already pursuing your goals. And the same with government agencies. The Seattle Chief Best just started community engagement now, and she's got the 10 community-based organizations that are Philippine, Vietnamese, LGBTQ, a lot of potential, but I've been involved with a lot of those, and they're not geared up yet to adapt to that let's all make friends kind of thing. So I'm wondering what locally and far away NGOs and government agencies might you recommend?
Thank you for that question. And I have to be very honest, and I say this in the book. I call out, and I went back to original NGOs and efforts of young people that I met in 2007 and 2008, who are the real stars of this work, because they've been doing it for a very, very long time. So there are many suggestions in the book, but one that I will call out now, and I work very closely with them, so you should know this. I tell you this. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London, that also has doing work here in the United States, is, in my view, the very best NGO in the world doing this work, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. They do work on the far right. They do work on the kind of extremism that I deal with, and they have been doing this since 2007. They have received a lot of attention and have been doing extraordinary, punching way above their weight. But I keep thinking they're the super secret sauce. And if I could take them and multiply them around the world, we would be doing some really, really amazing things. I also want to say, I should have said this earlier to one of the questions that was asked about what we can do. I've been inspired by a lot of American mayors who have taken on this idea of what kind of ethos they want to build in their cities. And so you can take somebody like Mayor Tate in Anaheim or Mayor Fisher in Louisville, Kentucky, and you can look at the kinds of things that they're deploying within their communities that may sound awfully cute, like that can never do anything, but I'll tell you, we know that certain touch points change the way you feel in a city, and how when a mayor talks about being a city of kindness or a city of compassion, it actually makes a difference. And I've been saying there's something called the Strong Cities Network globally that's actually run out of the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, but we have international mayors and governors from all over the world. There are far more American mayors that should take part in it. It could be they're sharing best practices, they're learning from each other, and they're allowing, and this is, I think, the most important part here, it cannot just be government that makes the connections with these folks. The people who are actually doing the work need to talk to their peers who are doing it in other parts of the world. And one of the things that I did in the Bush administration, because the people I worked for allowed me to experiment and fail if I had to, that's the secret sauce also, by the way. You can fail if you want to, you know? Try it. Try it. It's all right to fail. But we built first-of-a-kind networks with young people who were rejecting the Al-Qaeda mantra. So when I saw that guy in Oslo and I connected him to the guy in Sicily, they had never met each other before. But I'm like, you're both doing the same thing. You need to meet. You need to meet. You need to meet. That kind of stuff is unbelievably powerful because government stays out of the way. The people who are actually doing the work get together and say, hey, how did you do that? What did you do? Can I learn from you? Can we do this? That's what's going to make a difference. We've got to do that at a scale that can actually make a difference.
Thank you. On the topic of NGOs, there are a few institutions, the Foundation Center, the Human Rights Funders Network, that do databases on particularly around issues like CVE as well as other issues related to violence and extremism. So there are resources for that information. One thing that's problematic, though, is many governments have instituted NGO laws that eliminate their agency and that really squelch their opportunity to do anything because they are labeled foreign agents. They are labeled as funded by foreign agents and denied funding. They are scrutinized and, in many cases, closed down. That's not my question, though. It relates to misogyny and the fact that there is a linkage seen certainly within the U.S. within the white supremacist terrorism that has occurred. That there is histories of domestic violence, of killing within their own families, and I would say that is readily identifiable within terrorist extremist organizations and ideologies globally. Could you speak to that?
Well, it's a important point to raise. I will say to you that I am not a scholar on white supremacist movements, so it's not fair for me to opine upon that. I don't think that's fair. But I will say that there are commonalities that we have seen, exactly as you've just described. I don't think that the jury is out on what we know because we haven't scrubbed the kind of intelligence and the kind of research that we really need to. There have been some really important work that's been done. ADL has done exceptional work, Anti-Defamation League, on white supremacists and what, on that piece of misogyny, what are common traits, what they're seeing. But I can't really say much more than please look at them for more data. Mark Pitcavage is the guy that is doing really wonderful work in that in ADL on that. Yeah.
I don't know if my question is related to it, but I'm in high school here, and I'm an exchange student from Pakistan. So I was helping my teacher here in global studies class, and they were studying about Islam. So 2 students came to me and asked this question that extremism is not related to like terrorism, and terrorism is not related to extremism. When there is a terrorist attack or any killing, why everyone's like, it pops up in everyone's mind about Muslims, like how terrorism is related to Muslims, like every terrorism attack is not done by Muslims, so why?
What's your name?
Zernain.
Zernain? It's nice to meet you. Are you having fun in Seattle? Yeah. First of all, coming out on an evening when you're in high school is pretty awesome, so thank you for doing that. And it's quite brave for you to ask that question, so thank you for doing that. Listen, I think that you and I both know that you're very young. In the 20 years since 9/11, let me just say this. There has been a linkage because there have been extraordinary acts of violence in the name of Islam by terrorist organizations, and you can't turn your head to that. The linkage, however, between Islam and terrorism, in this country, we don't teach world religions the way we could. We have the capacity to teach them better. And one of the weaknesses here is that many Americans, through the public school system, don't know a lot about Islam, right? So they see things in the paper, and their logical explanation is that must be, if they're not Muslim, they say, oh, well, that's what Muslims do. So that's how the link has happened, and because it's been reinforced for years and years and years and years, and nobody has pushed back against it in any real kind of way, you see sort of now a common refrain that, of course, this is the kind of thing that Muslims do, or this is what. So that's where it's coming from in some dimension, but it's not. America's not alone in this. You know, it's a worldwide conversation around what violent extremism is. It's also really troubling. You know, people that talk about religion or faith are not mainstream. It doesn't. I remember a conversation I had in Belgium in 2008 when a man of Pakistani descent was sitting with me, and he told me, how do you expect us to live in this country when God is dead? Okay? And his perspective was, in Pakistan, God is everywhere. You hear it 5 times a day. You think about it before you start. I mean, it's everywhere. The only country in the world, other than India, that religion, like it's there, it's in the air, it's everywhere around you, was my visits to Ireland, where the Irish told me, we get faith. It's okay to believe in God. It's all right to talk about it. So we have seen a change in the way people talk about faith and what's acceptable. Numbers of people going to church and going to synagogue and going to mosque have changed in our country. So all of these things mix into this narrative. You're in America at a very interesting time. And if I could offer you just one suggestion as you're navigating through this amazing experience as an exchange student, I hope you keep a diary. I hope you write down your thoughts, because this country will not be the same in the years ahead. I have faith in our nation. We are pushing back on hate. And maybe you will have a chance to look back at your time and say, when I was here in Seattle, things were pretty complicated in America because they didn't know how to do things. But guess what? Things changed. Good luck.
So
Great question.
thank you, everybody.